Good morning, everyone. So coming back in to talk about this week's video lecture, we are now into the Eighth Amendment. And there's a few key terms that I really wanted to talk to you about today because they will help clarify and the kind of just this basic framework to Eighth Amendment cases. So the Eighth Amendment in general has three clauses: an excessive bail clause, an excessive fines clause, and a cruel and unusual punishment clause. Excessive fines was just incorporated to the states in a case called Timms v. Indiana in February. And this means that states have to comply with that Eighth Amendment requirement that people cannot be punished with excessive fines. Excessive bail largely looks at are we charging the amount likely to guarantee your return, but no more than that. Bail should not be punitive. It is rooted in this idea that we charge you a sufficient amount to make sure you come back, and that's it. There is a challenge working its way through the federal courts right now. Georgia decided to preset bail for every single crime, and that has been challenged by the federal government as potentially violating the Eighth Amendment excessive bail requirement, because some offenders might need a cash bail and other offenders might or just return on their own recognizance. So it kind of removes that individuality from the equation, which may not be okay. We'll see. But the bulk of Eighth Amendment cases focus on the death penalty and cruel and unusual punishment. And as we start working our way through some of the concepts about the Eighth Amendment, you're going to see these three key terms kind of pop up over and over again. The first one is proportionality. For the death penalty and punishment in general to satisfy the Eighth Amendment cruel and unusual punishment clause, it must be proportionate. In other words, we should only punish the person for the harm they cause to society. There are limits to this idea. We don't always punish people exactly appropriate, exactly the amount of harm they cause. We don't, as I know here, we don't burn an arsonist. We don't rape a rapist. But the idea is that we can impose a sufficient prison sentence that reconciles that harm that you caused to society, that you are punished and you give back to society the harm you caused. Proportionality is largely driven by the ideas of retribution and deterrence. So as you're working your way through, if you see places where Supreme Court justices are talking about retribution or deterrence, you should start thinking about this idea of proportionality. Does the punishment match the harm caused? Again, as just a refresher, retribution is the idea of an eye for an eye. And deterrence is the idea that if we punish you, we can deter future crime. Now, most criminologists tend to think that deterrence can work, but for deterrence to work, the punishment needs to be swift and certain. And again, note, the severity is not part of the equation. Actually, really severe punishments tend to backfire. But swift, certain punishments are effective. However, currently, the death penalty is neither swift nor certain. Once someone receives a death sentence, they spend an average of 10 to 12 years on death row, and it is not uncommon to come across cases where a death row inmate has spent 30 or more years on death row. So that is certainly not swift, and then certain as well. About 2/3 of death penalty cases are overturned for a serious error, and the most common errors are either the prosecutor withheld. The second most common error is prosecutor withheld exculpatory evidence, and the most common error is ineffective assistance of defense counsel. So the death penalty doesn't really meet those basic requirements for deterrence to work, but it is a common reason that people give for their continued support of the death penalty. There are a few groups that cannot be punished by death because these cannot possibly be the worst of the worst offenders. So under this idea of proportionality, we see the death penalties reserved for the worst of the worst, and these groups of people can never be the worst of the worst. They are categorically exempt. Those groups are juveniles. Juveniles are measured by when you committed the crime. If you are 17 and 364 days, you are a juvenile for this purpose, and you cannot receive the death penalty. Incompetence, people who are incompetent cannot be executed. This generally encompasses those who are insane or those who have a physical ailment like Alzheimer's or dementia. As we just noted a couple minutes ago, the death penalty is becoming older and older. People spend a lot of time there. And we have started to see more and more inmates have these severe health problems that render them incapable of being executed. And then the last group are those who are intellectually disabled. This is rooted in the Atkins v. Virginia case that you will look through. And this is a very, very specific diagnosis that manifests in childhood, is supported by diagnoses from schools and psychiatrists, where the person has an IQ 2 standard deviations below the normal, so 70 or under, and that they struggle with day-to-day tasks. So they can't drive a car. They're not capable of cooking their own food. They're not capable of telling time. They struggle with the day-to-day tasks that you need to succeed in life. So that is a specific type of person who's intellectually disabled. Okay. So if you have any questions, let me know. I think proportionality is really important to understand, and these concepts will be on your final exam when we talk about the Eighth Amendment. The next major concept that we will see is arbitrariness. A synonym for arbitrariness is randomness. And essentially what this means is it is cruel and unusual to randomly or arbitrarily impose the death penalty. Similarly situated offenders should receive a similar punishment. And if we are not doing that, then we are running afoul of the Eighth Amendment cruel and unusual punishment. Frequently, challenges to sentences, when a petitioner challenges their death sentence, these are frequently rooted in extra legal factors, in that they are arguing that the state is punishing them more severely because of their race, their ethnicity, their religion, their biological sex, their sexual orientation. For some, there's some other characteristic they are being treated unfairly. Okay. And the last term that you will see come over and over again is the idea of the evolving standards of decency. This has been in Eighth Amendment cases since the 1960s, and this refers to the idea that the death penalty punishments need to be rooted in contemporary society. This concept impacts both who we execute and how we execute people. Under this analysis, we will sometimes see the Supreme Court look to other jurisdictions, other European countries, Canada and such, to see how they are doing it if those countries still have the death penalty. Many of them don't. But we see them looking out and saying, how should this be executed? And in some ways, this makes sense. We used to hang people, or we used to draw and quarter them, so we would tie a limb to multiple different horses or wagons, and we would pull them apart to execute them. And there's really no one who seriously advocates that we return to those types of executions. And we also see that as we've learned more about disabilities and juvenile brain development and incompetence, that it is no longer really fair to execute those individuals. So this idea of evolving standards of decency is a strong theme that runs throughout Eighth Amendment cases. If you have any questions about any of these terms, please let me know. These terms are going to appear on your final in some way. You do need to know these and understand and potentially recognize that, hey, this is based on arbitrariness, or this is based on proportionality. So if you have any questions, please let me know. The handful of death penalty cases you had this week, the first one is Furman v. Georgia in 1972. The outcome of this case is the Supreme Court finds that the way the death penalty is currently being used, it is neither proportionate and it is arbitrary. Therefore, they place a moratorium on the death penalty. In other words, no executions were allowed to be carried out, and everyone who had a death sentence at that point in time had their sentence commuted to life in prison without parole. 4 years later, there's the Gregg v. Georgia case, which you all journaled this week, and that is Georgia coming back to the Supreme Court and saying, we have made changes to our death penalty process to ensure proportionality and reduce arbitrariness. One mechanism put into place that still exists today is the use of a bifurcated trial. All death penalty cases have 2 trials, one trial to determine guilt or innocence, and a second trial to determine the punishment. Will this person receive death or not? So that was implemented in the late 1970s. As one way to reduce proportionality and randomness, to make sure that we are truly punishing the worst offenders in a similar way, that we are appropriately punishing people. We also saw the introduction of aggravating factors to help states determine who is the worst offender. So by and large, to receive a death sentence, you have to possess some specific number of aggravating factors in how you carried out your murder. You also have an unlimited right to present mitigating factors to reduce your culpability for punishment. So the defense can bring up a myriad of factors. Frequently, these factors look at childhood abuse and neglect, drug and alcohol dependency and addiction, mental illnesses, things like that are some common themes in these types of cases that offenders bring up to in an attempt to spare themselves from execution. And then the last case we talked about, or you journaled, was Woodson v. North Carolina. This was the contemporary to Gregg. So Woodson, or North Carolina, Georgia proposed bifurcated trials, aggravating and mitigating factors. North Carolina proposed an alternative. Their alternative was that they would execute everyone who was sentenced to a first-degree murder. The Supreme Court struck that down because that is not proportionate, and it removes individuality from consideration, which makes it cruel and unusual. One reason I like to have students still read this case is every once in a while we will hear somebody bring up this idea, like we can make the death penalty more efficient, we can make it more fair if we just, everyone who has this sentence gets this punishment. And so North Carolina did try that, and we see the Supreme Court striking that down as violating the 8th Amendment. There does have to be some individual consideration here. So that's kind of a introduction to the death penalty. As we work through, you will see these kind of ideas, proportionality, arbitrariness, and evolving standards of decency appear over and over again. And then we are really going to start digging into who we execute, who we don't execute, and how we execute. So we're going to read some cases about punishment and pain, and we're going to see some more information coming about lethal injections, which is the most common method of executions in existence today. So if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. I hope you have a great rest of your week.